I want to start this week's video with a story. So there I am, it's a Monday morning. I'm sitting at my dining room table ready to start work. Over the weekend, I created a goal for myself to have one new coaching client by the end of the week. And in order for me to hit that goal, I needed to call people to tell them about my coaching. So I pulled out my phone and I started scrolling my contacts. And the longer I scrolled, the more I began to feel tense, anxious, and actually somewhat drained, even though it was morning and I just woke up. Eventually, I called 3 people. None of them pick up. And for me, that's like, yes, it's a sigh of relief. And I mark my task completed. So the rest of the week goes by. And every day, I look at that task on my list. Call 3 people, call 3 people, call 3 people. And every time I see it, I say to myself, I'll do it later, I'll do it later, I'll do it later. You can probably guess what happened. Of course, I did not get any new coaching clients. And by the end of the week, on top of that experience of anxiety that I had, I'm also now frustrated with myself and doubting myself and my ability to grow my practice. Some of you probably can relate to this experience, especially in the area of your 10x goal. It's this experience of procrastinating, taking the exact actions that we know we need to take in order to get what we want, and then feeling frustrated. Or we might not feel frustrated, we might just ignore it and sweep it under the rug. But what is really at the root of these experiences? I'll give you a clue. What was actually happening for me as I scrolled down my contact list is I came across a number of names, and I saw the name, I was like, what do they think about me? And what would they think about me if I called them right now? And I became afraid. And it gets deeper. One of the fundamental functions of the organ called our brain is just to keep us alive. Just like the heart's job is to pump blood, our brains developed in order to be able to navigate the world successfully, keep us alive as long as possible, and reproduce. It's like as your brain came into development, it said to itself, I have one mission: to keep myself, my container, safe for as long as possible and to make more of me. With that being its mission, it began to search for and respond to stimuli in the environment that occurred as threats. As a baby, it's simple. When you feel hunger or some type of discomfort, you cry, and then you get a reward, warmth and nourishment, and your brain says, oh, this is what I need to do to keep myself safe. And as cavemen, we learn to pick up on sounds, smells, sights, and other cues that would help bring us closer to safety and protection and help us avoid potential predators or dangerous tribes. So when you heard something, your brain will automatically imagine all of the possible outcomes, all of the threats that could be behind that. That was its job, and it was really good at it, because at that time, failure to see the signs and respond appropriately actually meant death. But then 2 things happened. 1, we grew up, and 2, society evolved. And as that happened, many of the things that were actually real threats to us either disappeared or no longer apply. However, one of our brain's primary jobs, to keep us alive and scan for threats, remained the same. And with most of our needs actually met and most of the dangers removed, then the meaning of survival changed. We are no longer trying to survive starvation or imminent attack. Failure no longer means certain death in most cases. Now, all of our efforts to survive are focused on avoiding threats like ridicule, rejection, disappointment, inadequacy, or failure to be successful in today's society. However it is you define that. And there is an evolutionary link to this. Because if in the past we were rejected or ridiculed or inadequate, then we would be ostracized from the tribe and we wouldn't be able to survive. Now our brains unconsciously associate those things with certain death. So it absolutely must find all the cues and signs that those threats might be present. Imagine possible negative outcomes and do what it takes for you to survive. So most of the time when we have this experience of being stopped, constrained, disempowered, or repeatedly sabotaging ourselves, guess what the root cause actually is? It is an imaginary threat that you are reacting to as if it's real. When you want to do something yet you can't take the action, it's because your brain has labeled something about that thing as a threat to your life. And then you react. You react emotionally, and you react by doing things that help you avoid the threat, whether consciously or unconsciously. Most of the time it's unconscious. You can literally map it according to fight, flight, or freeze reactions. You might become hypervigilant, work harder, do more, double down, feel anxious, feel frantic, become high-strung, attack your to-do list or somebody else, all to help you fight off whatever you think the potential threat is. Or you might run away, mostly metaphorically, but sometimes literally. You might actually try to numb or suppress your emotions and then take actions or avoid taking action so that you can get further away from whatever you think the threat is. Or you might just freeze. And freezing is like when you get overwhelmed. Like we can't do anything. We just have this deep experience of fear. Essentially, either we don't take action or we take actions that don't actually work to help us get what we want. And each of us has our own particular unique ways of reacting. And I want to emphasize reacting because much of it is automatic and unconscious. Some of you may have already had the experience of realizing that the thing you're worried about isn't actually real. You might have told yourself that it isn't true, and yet you still feel stopped or constrained or disempowered. This is because it's hardly ever the surface fear or worry that's actually impacting us. Remember, our brains are brilliant machines at imagining potential threatening outcomes so that it can increase the probability of keeping us safe. So most surface fears or worries that you are aware of actually lead down a rabbit hole of other deeper threats that we hardly ever see but feel nonetheless. Your power comes from simply going down the rabbit hole, seeing all of the invisible threats that are down there and making them visible. Once you can see that whole world and get that that isn't true, then you begin to taste real freedom. Recall the story that I told you guys at the beginning of this video. I began to disrupt experiences like those by stopping and asking myself, what's the threat here? And then, what's the threat behind that? And the threat behind that? When I apply it to calling people for my coaching practice, I discovered that I had a fear that whoever I called would think I was being fake, opportunistic, or an inconvenience. And the threat behind that was that if they saw me that way, then they would reject me. And the threat behind that was that if they reject me, then I'm not a successful coach, or I won't be a successful coach. That's what I was feeling anxious about and what ultimately caused my procrastination. And you can see how it's a self-fulfilling prophecy, because my fear of not being a successful coach led me to not making the phone calls that I needed to make. Once I could see that, then I had the power to actually ask myself if all of those imagined threats were true, and then to replace them with empowering thoughts. For me, those empowering thoughts were like this: the reason I'm making these calls is because I want to make a difference for people. And if they say no or show that they aren't interested, it has nothing to do with me. That's their perceptions. And even if 10 people say no, and they actually probably will, then I can and still will have massive success, because that's what it takes. This actually left me feeling secure, confident, and detached from the outcomes of making the phone calls. And I no longer procrastinated. When we can get to the root and then separate fact from fiction, then our entire way of being begins to shift just by seeing that. And it might not happen instantly. Repeatedly catching yourself is the key. So now recall your biggest problems, complaints, blocks, or constraints. Your work is to begin to ask yourself, what's the threat here? And then what's the threat behind that? And go all the way to the bottom. And for a bonus, I'll give you a really interesting question to reflect on that's often behind people who self-sabotage themselves. In the area of your 10x game, what would be the worst or the most threatening thing about you actually taking the action, achieving your goal, or being successful? I want you to pause this video and reflect on that. Write it down. Once you identify it, then ask yourself the same questions. What's the threat? And then what's the threat behind that? All the way down to the bottom. Then once you get down to the bottom, then you can give yourself a reality check. And you do so by asking yourself these 4 incredibly powerful questions. The first question is just, is it true? And listen, the only things that actually count as true are the things that we can observe, that we can see. It's like, what are the facts about what happened? And then you want to separate that from what is my interpretation of the facts. That part is the fiction. Not necessarily because it's inaccurate, but because it's up here and not out there. The second question is for you to really get the impact. You ask yourself, how do I react when I think this thought? How do I start to feel? What do I start to do? And then how does that actually play out? And if you dig deep enough here, you might actually discover a self-fulfilling prophecy where through you reacting to that fear, you actually contribute to that fear coming true. The third question is, how would I be without this thought? Or if it no longer impacted me? And when you ask this, just close your eyes and imagine, like if that thought was just not there, how you would actually be being. And then when you're being that way, what would you do differently? And if you did that differently, then what would be the outcome? What would happen? The final question is, what empowering thoughts can I replace this with? Empowering thoughts can be, but are not always, the direct opposite of the threatening thought. Think about what my empowering thoughts were. It's often the most realistic, positive counter to the threatening thought. And once you actually do the work of separating fact from fiction and getting the impact of that thought, then this part comes relatively easy. So that's all for this week. Happy threat hunting. Peace.